Hey guys, welcome to Kiwoon Learning, and this is the introduction to investing. And today we're going to be talking about the basic metrics for value investing. So today you're going to be able to learn how to value if a company is overvalued or it's undervalued. Now in this video we're going to be talking about 4 different metrics: the price to earnings ratio, the debt to equity ratio, the price to earnings growth ratio, and finally the price to book ratio. So how about we get started? Now this is going to be a 2-part series, so in this video we're going to be talking more about the basics, and then our next video we'll be diving more into the advanced metrics. Now the first metric we're going to be talking about is the price to earnings ratio, also known as the PDE ratio. Now the price to earnings ratio takes into account the price of the stock and the earnings per share. So it takes the price and it divides it by the earnings per share. Now what the PDE ratio does is it tells an investor whether a stock is overvalued or undervalued, but it also tells a person whether investors are willing to pay a premium for that company's stock. Now let me explain the PDE ratio in context. So because we know that the PDE ratio is a fraction, we know that if it's higher, that means the price of the stock is higher than the earnings per share. And if it's lower, that means that the earnings per share is higher than the price per share. Now going more into detail, a higher PDE ratio indicates that investors are willing to pay a higher price for the company's potential growth. Now with a low PDE ratio, this can indicate that investors aren't really sure about a company's potential growth. However, the thing is that a low PDE ratio could indicate that a company is highly undervalued because the price is lower than their earnings per share. Now, something that you have to understand is that you have to compare the PDE ratios to other stocks, but not just any other stocks. They have to be in the same sector. For example, comparing AT&T to T-Mobile makes perfect sense because they're both network carriers. Now, if you were to compare AT&T to something like Amazon, they don't really have anything in common, so the PDE ratios will be different and you might have skewed results. Now, another thing that you have to understand is that the PDE ratio won't tell you whether a company is good or bad. It simply just indicates the price compared to its earnings per share. So you get a feel of whether a company is overvalued or undervalued, and you can also see how investors feel about the potential growth of that company. Now, another thing that you have to understand is that you have to compare that stock to other stocks in the same sector, so that you have a general basis of how that stock is doing compared to the others. Now let's hop on to the next metric, the DDE ratio, or the debt to equity ratio. Now what the debt to equity ratio takes into account, it takes the total liabilities or the debt of a company and it divides it by the shareholders' equity. In this case, you want the debt to equity ratio to be closer to 0 because this indicates that a company is more stable and has a better grounding. Now typically you do not want to have a company whose DDE ratio is 2 because this indicates that the liabilities are double the shareholders' equity. Now there are exceptions to this rule, such as companies that are in fixed asset heavy industries, such as mining or manufacturing. This basically just means that they have to pay large sums of money to get their company running because they have to have heavy, big machinery. Now these companies may have a DDE ratio that is over 2, but these companies are exceptions to that rule. Now let me give you an example. Let's say that a company's total liabilities or debt was equal to $12,000. Now let's say that the total shareholders' equity was $10,000. This means that if you just divide the 12,000 by the 10,000, you would get a D to E ratio of 1.2. Now if a company's DDE ratio is lower than 1, they're seen as a more safe company and they have more reliability. Now if a company's DDE ratio is over 2, this is seen as more risky. Now to wrap up the DDE ratio, basically the DDE ratio just indicates how stable a company is. And the lower the DDE ratio is, the better it is. Now, let's dive right into the next metric known as the PEG ratio, or the price to earnings to growth ratio. Now, the PEG ratio takes the price to earnings ratio and divides it by the estimated earnings per share growth. Now, in this case, you want to have a PEG ratio that is 1 or lower because this indicates that the current valuation of a company isn't growing faster than the estimated growth. Now, this is important because this indicates that a company is overvalued and you can see a potential correction. If the PEG ratio is less than 1, this indicates that a company is undervalued because the company's valuation still has a little bit left to grow. So if you invest your money when the PEG ratio is over 1 and you see the correction, you are going to lose money because the company's valuation is going to drop down to the estimated growth. Now, if you invest when the PEG ratio is less than 1, this means that you can grow your money because the company's valuation still has a little bit more to grow. So you can take those profits from that growth. Because the PEG ratio takes into consideration the estimated earnings per share growth, this allows it to give investors a more complete picture of a company's valuation. The final basic metric is the price to book ratio, or the P to B ratio. Now, to get an understanding of the P to B ratio, you first have to understand what a book value is. Let's say that a company got a magic genie and they had one wish left. So they decided to remove all their liabilities. What would be left is the book value. The book value essentially is just the total assets that a company has. The buildings, the transportation, the technology. So when you're looking at the PDB ratio, you're looking at the price of the company compared to the price of the total assets. Now why this is important is because if the price is lower than the book value, that means if they just sold all their assets outright, they would have more money than the price of the actual company. So this means that the company's stock is undervalued. Usually a PDB ratio less than 1 indicates that a stock is undervalued, just as I said before. Now this can be different with bigger, more developed companies, where investors start to consider PDB ratios that are less than 3. Typically the PDB ratio is used for long-term investments, and this is because they can be used to find sleeper stocks before hedge funds or other investors catch on. And this is because with a low PDB ratio, you can find stocks that are incredibly undervalued. So by the time that the stock price comes back up to the correct valuation, you still would have made a profit. To wrap up the PDB ratio, if a company has a high PDB ratio, this could indicate that they're overvalued. But this can also indicate that they're trying to grow their assets so that they can grow profits in the future. Now, if a company has a low PDB ratio, this could indicate that they're undervalued because the total price of the company itself is lower than the total assets that they have. And that just about wraps up this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you guys found this helpful and educational. If you liked the video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Peace.